Goethe wrote that none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. He was writing about love, not hostages, but the line survived because captivity rarely announces itself as captivity. Sometimes it feels like home. The phenomenon we now call Stockholm Syndrome was named in 1973 after a Swedish bank robbery in which 4 hostages, held for 6 days, came out defending their captor and raising money for his legal defense. The name was new. The thing it described was not. It had been quietly running for 2,000 years. Risto here. History buff, not historian. English isn't my first language. That's kind of the point. Learn a little, laugh a little. That's the deal. Human nature doesn't change, and neither does the plot. History rhymes and keeps the receipts. I mean, somebody always writes it down. 4 people today. A Berber prince paraded through Rome as a child who grew up to write Roman history in Greek. Christian boys from the Balkans, taken from their parents at 8, who grew up to die defending the empire that took them. A Russian survivor of the Gulag, who watched fellow prisoners weep when their tormentor died. And a young American heiress, kidnapped at 19, who joined her captors and robbed a bank with them 2 months later. Let's start in Rome, around 46 BC. The man we are talking about was about 5 years old. His father, Juba the First, had been the king of Numidia, a kingdom in what is now Algeria and Tunisia, and had made the unfortunate decision to back Pompey in his civil war against Julius Caesar. Pompey lost. Juba the First, knowing what defeat meant for a defeated North African king, committed suicide. His small son, Juba the Second, was taken to Rome. What happened next is, in some ways, the most refined version of the captive's transformation that history has ever produced. The child was first paraded through Rome in Caesar's triumphal procession, a public spectacle in which captives and treasure were displayed to the cheering crowd. Then he disappeared from public view and was quietly placed in the household of Octavia, Caesar's great niece. Octavia raised him alongside her own children. He learned Latin and Greek. He was taught by the best scholars in Rome. By the age of 20, he had already written a treatise on Roman history, in Greek, Roman archaeology, and he was beginning to make a reputation as one of the most learned young men of his generation. Octavian, who became the Emperor Augustus, adopted Juba almost as a project. He gave him Roman citizenship. He took him on military campaigns. He brought him to the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, where Mark Antony and Cleopatra were defeated. And then, in 25 BC, Augustus gave him a kingdom, Mauritania, in what is now northern Morocco and western Algeria. And here is the part that matters. Juba the Second married Cleopatra Selene, the daughter of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, herself a captive raised in Rome by the same Octavia. 2 children of defeated kings, raised in Roman households, sent back to North Africa to rule on Rome's behalf. Their marriage had been arranged, their loyalty had been engineered. Juba ruled Mauritania for almost 50 years. He renamed its capital Caesarea in honor of the emperor who had made him. He wrote books in Greek and Latin on geography, history, painting, theatre, botany. Pliny the Elder quotes him 65 times. He sent expeditions to the Canary Islands, which his scholars described in such detail that Western Europe used his maps for centuries. The interesting detail, the one that gives the story its edge, is this. His own subjects revolted against him several times. They considered him too Roman to rule. He had to be propped up by Roman legions during civil unrest between 26 and 20 BC. He was a Berber prince writing in Greek for Romans. in a North African kingdom whose people barely recognized him as one of their own. There is no record of Juba ever expressing regret, no record of him longing for Numidia, no private letter saying, "I should have been someone else." He died in his palace, in his Roman-named city, surrounded by Roman books, having spent 50 years being exactly what Augustus had raised him to be. We jump forward 14 centuries to the late 1300s and the system that the Ottoman sultans built around the same idea, scaled up to industrial size. The Ottoman Empire in its early period had a problem. The empire was Turkish and Muslim, but the Turkish nobility was unreliable. They had their own clans, their own ambitions, their own rival loyalties. A sultan who promoted his Turkish lords too quickly ended up surrounded by men whose first loyalty was not to him. So in the 1360s, under Sultan Murad I, the Ottomans began a practice called the devshirme, meaning the collection, sometimes translated as the child levy or the blood tax. Every few years, Ottoman officials would travel through the Christian villages of the Balkans, what is now Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Albania, Bosnia, and select boys aged 8 to 20. Roughly one boy from every 40 families. The boys were taken from their parents and walked, sometimes hundreds of kilometers, back to Istanbul. There they were converted to Islam. They were given new names. They were forbidden to communicate with their families. They were placed in schools where they learned Turkish, Arabic, Persian, calligraphy, mathematics, horsemanship, the Quran, and, above all, war. They lived in barracks, under monastic discipline, and they were taught one principle above all others. They were the personal property of the Sultan, and their loyalty was to him alone. The best of them became administrators, governors, generals, grand viziers, the highest office in the empire below the Sultan himself. The majority became the Janissaries, Janissaries, the new troops, an elite infantry corps that terrified Europe for 3 centuries. Now here is what makes the system fit our theme. These Christian boys, ripped from their families, converted by force, never allowed to return home. These boys, in their tens of thousands, became the most ferociously loyal defenders of the empire that had taken them. They fought at Kosovo, at Constantinople, at Vienna. They defended the Sultan against his Turkish nobles. They died in their thousands to protect a system that had, in their childhoods, treated them as a tax. And the system became so effective that some families began to offer their sons voluntarily, even Muslim ones, who were technically not eligible. The path from Sultan's slave to Grand Vizier was unmatched anywhere else in the empire. Captivity, properly engineered, became aspirational. The Janissaries existed for 460 years. By the end, they had become so powerful that they assassinated sultans who displeased them. The captives were running the cage. It took a massacre in 1826 when Sultan Mahmud II lured them into a square and bombarded them with artillery to end the corps. About 6,000 Janissaries were killed in a single day. The system that had built itself by stealing children was finally destroyed by the descendants of the children it had stolen. We jump forward another 5 centuries to the Soviet Union under Stalin. Between roughly 1929 and 1953, the Soviet state ran a network of labor camps called the Gulag, an acronym for Glavnoye Upravlenie Lagery, the central administration of prison camps. 18 million people passed through it. Somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people died inside it. It was one of the most efficient systems of repression ever built. Not a death camp in the Nazi sense, but a vast machine for breaking human beings down to the level where they no longer remembered who they had been. Prisoners cut down trees at -40 in shoes wrapped in rags, working 12 hours for the daily ration of black bread. Some men disappeared overnight, a name taken off the roll call, a bunk emptied before dawn, and nobody asked where they had gone, because asking was its own kind of disappearance. The man who described it best from the inside was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He had been a Red Army artillery captain during the Second World War. In February 1945, while serving on the German front, he wrote a private letter to a friend in which he made a joke about Stalin. The letter was intercepted. He was arrested, sentenced to 8 years, and sent into the system he would later spend 15 years writing about. What Solzhenitsyn observed inside the Gulag, and what he could barely believe at the time, is what concerns us today. When Stalin died in March 1953, news of his death spread through the camps within hours, and many prisoners, not all, but many, wept. Some of them stood in the snow and cried for the dictator who had put them there. Some of them refused to believe the news. Some of them said openly that they could not imagine the country without him. These were not Stalinist officials. These were victims. Men and women who had been arrested for jokes, for letters, for the wrong word at the wrong dinner table. Men and women whose families had been broken, whose health had been destroyed, whose lives had been written off by the regime they were now mourning.
And the last story, which is the youngest and the most modern of all. On the 4th of February 1974, in a Berkeley apartment, a 19-year-old college student was beaten, bound, and thrown into the trunk of a car. Her name was Patricia Hearst. She was the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, one of the most powerful media tycoons in American history. Her kidnappers were a small group of radical leftists who called themselves the Symbionese Liberation Army. 8 people, more or less, led by an escaped convict named Donald DeFries. The SLA's stated goal was to start a guerrilla war against the United States government. Their first major action, before the Hearst kidnapping, had been the murder of a school superintendent in Oakland. They were not, by any sober analysis, going to overthrow the United States. But they had captured a Hearst, which gave them, for a few months, the attention of the entire country. What happened next is what makes this story belong in today's episode. For the first weeks of her captivity, Patty Hearst was kept in a closet. She was blindfolded. She was, according to her own later testimony, sexually abused. She was lectured constantly on Marxist revolutionary theory by people she could not see. She was told her family had abandoned her, that the FBI wanted her dead, that her only hope of survival was to join her captors. 2 months later, on the 3rd of April 1974, she released an audio recording. In it, she announced that she had renounced her family, her class, and her former identity. She had chosen, she said, to stay with the SLA. She had taken a new name, Tanya, in honor of a woman who had fought alongside Che Guevara. 12 days after the recording, on the 15th of April, security cameras inside the Hibernia Bank in San Francisco filmed her. Patty Hearst, M1 carbine in hand, robbing the bank with 3 other SLA members. She participated in further robberies, including one in which a bystander was killed. She lived underground for over a year. When she was finally arrested in September 1975, she gave her occupation to the booking officer as urban guerrilla. She was tried for armed bank robbery in 1976. Her defence argued she had been brainwashed, that she was the textbook case of what the psychiatrist Nils Bejerot had called, 3 years earlier, Stockholm syndrome. The prosecution argued she had joined the SLA voluntarily. The jury found her guilty. She was sentenced to 7 years and served 22 months before President Carter commuted her sentence. President Clinton later pardoned her completely. Decades later, after she had married, had children, and rebuilt an entirely conventional life, she gave an interview in which she said something striking. She said she had never been able to fully explain, even to herself, what had happened to her in that closet. The conversion had been real while it was happening. She had believed every word she said as Tanya. And then, one day, she didn't. Anyone who has stayed too long in a job that quietly destroyed them, or in a relationship that slowly rewrote what they expected from love, anyone who has caught themselves defending a system that was hurting them, has felt, in a much smaller way, what Patty Hearst and the Janissaries and Juba the Second all felt. The cage doesn't have to have bars. Sometimes it has a salary, a wedding ring, a flag. Solzhenitsyn, who had watched men weep for Stalin in the snow, came to one conclusion above all others. He wrote it in the Gulag archipelago, and it stands as the last word on today's episode. Gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties, but right through every human heart. The captive who comes to love the captor is not a freak. He is us, in conditions we have, so far, been lucky enough to avoid. I'm Risto. Thanks for listening. See you next time. By the way, if you enjoyed this, the easiest way to support the show is to subscribe. That way you won't miss the next one.